Chapter 17 Finding a Son. Some days later, as Paul was talking to Barnabas, he said, "Come, Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in every town where we have proclaimed the word. Let us see how they are doing." Barnabas said, "Yes, I agree. Who shall we take with us? I suggest my nephew, young John Mark." Paul frowned at this. "I do not want," he said, "to have as our helper the man who turned back and shirked the dangers of carrying the message when we were in Pamphylia." It would not be easy for Paul to avoid hurting Barnabas's feelings in telling him that his nephew, John Mark, had not the spirit of courage and the sturdiness needed in men who must be ready to risk their lives at any hour and take a stoning or a beating without flinching. Indeed, it is likely that Paul's quick temper would lead him to say this abruptly. Barnabas maybe thought that John Mark ought to have a second chance, but Paul would not take the risk. We can see that he was right in thinking that they must not have a man with them who would fail at a pinch. In any case, what Paul said made Barnabas so angry that he would have nothing more to do with his old friend. Barnabas took his kinsman, young John Mark, and went off on a missionary journey to his native place, Cyprus, leaving Paul in Antioch. It cut Paul to the quick to part from the great comrade of his first journey. He and Barnabas had faced stoning, fever and robbers together, and had shared the perils of river and road and sea. But Paul knew that he was on a great enterprise, where any man was unfit who, like John Mark, quailed before death or feared to take any adventure that might come to him. Paul never thought of himself as a hero. He only knew that he cared so much for the carrying out of God's great aim that he forgot his own safety. So Paul could claim rightly, "I prove myself at all points a true servant to God, by great endurance, by suffering, by troubles, by calamities, by lashes, by imprisonment, mobbed, toiling, sleepless, starving." So even for the love of Barnabas his comrade, he could not take with him a man like John Mark, whom he believed to be unready to face all these things. Barnabas, therefore, all sore and angry in spirit, went down with John Mark to the port at Seleucia to set sail westward. We do not hear that Paul and Barnabas ever met again. Paul went to ask the friend with whom he had many talks on their way up from the council at Jerusalem, Silas, whether he would go out on the long perilous journey over the mountains to the people of the plateau. He, like Paul, though a Jew, was a Roman citizen. His full Roman name was Silvanus, but his friends called him Silas for short. Paul wanted Silas to go with him across the Taurus mountains to the Roman cities of Derbe and Lystra, Iconium and Antioch. Silas would be a great help to Paul there, not only because he was a Roman Jew, but because he had been at the Jerusalem Council, where they had decided on the message to the nations. The strict Christian Jews in these Roman cities of the province of Galatia might say that Paul was a crank without any authority to tell the nations they might come into the fellowship without circumcision. But they would find it difficult to say such things to Silas, who came from the church at Jerusalem itself carrying a letter signed by James. Paul and his new friend Silas started out northward. A little band of the brethren came to give them a send-off. The flush of sunrise was reflected in the Orontes on their right as they crossed the bridge which carried them out to the northern plain. They had a long camping journey of many weeks ahead of them, in which they must be ready to wade across streams, skirt lakes, climb great mountain passes, and trudge over wide plains. They would probably take asses with them, who would carry, in saddlebags slung across their backs, water bottles, their oil and cheese and olives for the midday meal, an iron crock for cooking their dish of corn and meat at night, their hooded cloaks for shelter from the rain or mountain snow, and for sleeping in at night. Sometimes they joined a company of traders, who travelled along the road together for defence against the robbers. They would take special care to do this when they began to climb from the great plain, round the curving roads among the brown hills, and up into the brigand-infested ravines of the mountains that divided Syria, the province in which Damascus and Antioch lay, from Cilicia, the province of Paul's own boyhood, where Tarsus stood. Paul and Silas talked as they rode along or walked by the side of the asses. Paul was very proud of his native city, toward which they were travelling. He would be sure to tell Silas stories of his life when he was a boy in Tarsus there. He could, as they came to rest in the evening at one of the caravan centres, point to black low tents stretched around them on the camping ground, made of the famous Tarsian goat's hair cloth. The cloth was known all over the Roman Empire as Cilicium, because it came from this Cilician plain on which Paul was born. Silas knew that Paul had been trained as a tent maker. Paul could tell him, "I intend to earn my living at my trade whenever I stay in a city to preach. In that way I shall stop men from saying that I follow Christ just to get a livelihood." We can be certain that Silas and he would discuss the quarrel with Barnabas, and they would wish that there were some younger man like John Mark, only braver, with them as a helper. "There is a young fellow in Lystra over the mountains," Paul might say, "named Timothy, i.e., fear God. He became a disciple of Jesus Christ when I was there. His father is a Greek and his mother a Jewess. I believe he would make a fine helper in place of John Mark." Talking in this way they came down among the towns in the Cilician plain where Paul preached and taught in these quiet years before Barnabas came to fetch him to Antioch. As Paul came through the streets of these towns in Cilicia, the faces of the Christian people, cobbling and baking in their little shops, lighted up with gladness when they saw their old friend come back. They would run and bring together the other brethren who lived in the town, and they would listen eagerly to Paul who had, years before, by his teaching brought them into the new and splendid fellowship. We are not told what he said to them, but without doubt he would say simple, straight words like these which he wrote to his friends: "My brothers, whom I love and have longed to see, stand fast. I wish greatly that your love may grow more and more in knowledge and in all judgment, so that you may be keen on the things that are really good." Then those two splendid sentences that might be the command of a commander to his armies: "Stand fast together in one spirit, with one mind, working hard together for the faith of the good news." Do not be at all terrified by your enemies. You are to have the gift of going through hard times on behalf of Christ, fighting battles like those through which I have gone. "Do all your work," he went on, "without muttering and disputing with one another, so that you may not be open to blame and may do harm to no one. Live like sons of God among a crooked-minded and contrary nation, shining in the midst of them like lights in the world, holding out as a torch the word of life." In many of these places the same hard question came up, the Jews declaring that everybody must come under the law and the others saying no. It was a great help to them when Silas brought out his parchment and read aloud the letter that said they were not to have this burden laid upon them. At last they came out on the bank of the river Cydnus and reached the great city of Tarsus. Paul's father and mother must have been very old by this time, if indeed they had not died. Some of his old schoolmates would not speak to him. They had grown to be strict Pharisees who would have nothing to do with Paul since he had become a Christian.